Hey guys, and welcome back to another drawing video. Today's mission is doing screenshot studies from the animated movie Stranger on the Shore or Seaside Stranger to get better at drawing full background illustrations and stylizing beach scenes. The reasons I decided to go with screenshots instead of other people's illustrations, for example, is because I think especially anime movies are super good in hitting that level of detail that you need, while still not distracting from the actual focus on the screen, which is usually a character's. Also, I just think this particular movie is super pretty and fits the vibe for the illustration I'm personally working on super well. I hope that you'll once again find something to learn from seeing my process, and in case there are any questions, just feel free to leave them in the comments. And so for now, let's get right into it. So let's get to picking the screenshots. So these are the screenshots I took while watching the movie. I don't think they're in chronological order anymore, but as you can see, all of them have, first of all, a similar color palette, which is similar to the one I want for my illustration. I'm not sure if I've shown the work in process picture I'm working on already in the intro. If not, I'm going to put it on screen here. Yeah, while watching the movie, I considered what I struggle with the illustration that I'm working on myself. And as you can see, the illustration I'm working with has a landmass in the distance that is still an important part of the illustration. And also it's the ocean, it's the sky, it is not only the landmass, but also, the character. So while taking the screenshots, the things I considered were including these things, which is, for example, why this screenshot or this one are part of the collection, because there the land masses, including the plants, forest, whatever in the distance, are not the focus of the screenshot, but, more in focus than, for example, in the distance here. This one, for example, I included for the stylization of the ocean, same with this one. This one mainly for the transition between sand and ocean and just the details the artist used in the movie. So these are the screenshots I chose at all, and then I already did a little bit of a selection. So these ones I like for the color palette, which are close to what I want my illustration to look like. Similar to this one, I don't necessarily think I'm going to go with this color palette, but it's so pretty. So I want to, study this as inspiration. Here we have the stylization of the beach and the ocean. Here we have the landmass in the background, but still being an important part of the screenshot. Though I actually think I think I'm going to put that one there as well, because this is a nice reference. I don't think I'm gonna do a study of this one. I think this one is nicer for the study, or this one. But yeah, I'm gonna think about it. Here, as I said before, the landmass in the very far background, including the stylization of the ocean, the simplification, which this is not that simple, but you'll know what I mean when I do the studies. So I chose these ones before. Looking at them again, I definitely want to take this one and this one. Hello? This one and this one. Also, I think this one as well. So there we have 3 for now. Okay, I have one from the color palette, one from the ocean, one from that, and I guess I'm going to do this one as well. Yeah. So that's 4 screenshots. I think for my specific illustration, this might be a nice choice for studies. If I decide to do more, I can just do more at the end. But yeah, that's my choice for now. And the next part will be on my iPad. I decided to go with the simplest screenshot first as a warm-up, and also because this one includes the most important aspects for me to study: landmass and foliage in the distance, and stylizing the ocean surface. The colors are also super pretty, even if a bit monochromatic for my taste. They're even more monochromatic than I initially thought, because while matching the colors to use, I kept getting the hues wrong. The perceived light brown of the little ground you see, as well as the darker greens in the trees, are way closer to blue than it seems. Even though I knew there were blue hues, I kept getting too close to yellow or green. Another thing I realized about the colors was that many colors weren't as light as I thought, but instead less saturated. So instead of moving up on the color wheel, I move to the left, which makes the colors less intense. I think this is also probably why my artworks always tend to end up more saturated than I initially want them to be, even though I do like my art, pretty saturated. I also tried out different textured cloud brushes to match the vibe of the reference. The usual way for me to create clouds has been by painting them and then smudging, as well as erasing with the same cloud brush, which has been working very well for me. That also means I moved away from the screenshot here a little bit to make it my own, while still paying attention to the original's composition and colors. The cloud brushes I use are made by Devanel Kurz, by the way, and free to use, and I highly recommend them. For the solid objects, I put in the big shapes first with the lasso tool to block in the roll composition before even thinking about details. Something I expected to be a bit more of a challenge for me was the texture in the trees, but I guess since I had the reference right there, I could just stop myself from overworking them. It's actually just, the flat base color. Then I used the same brush I used for the clouds and added a darker color, then did the same thing with the highlight colors. At the end, I also smudged the edges a little bit to make them seem more organic. This is why I chose another way to add texture than the reference. The original artist seemed to have used some watercolor brushes, including the darker edges that watercolor strokes tend to have. But instead, I went with a pencil-like brush and outlined the bigger tree shapes manually. I also mimicked the vertical lines they added, but made them a bit more intense. This is something I've been doing in my own sketches lately, and something I'd like to introduce to my more involved illustrations. For my bachelor's project, I had already done some calm water surface drawings, so I roughly knew what I wanted. But I like how quote-unquote magical the water looks in the screenshot, so that's what I wanted to achieve. They achieved this effect not only with the colors, but with the reflecting sparkles. Those also help creating visual depth by just simply being bigger in the foreground. Overall, this screenshot was a great start to this study session, and I didn't feel overwhelmed by the level of information I had to take in, since I could fully focus on the colors and textures with this one. As for the second study, I chose the screenshot with a similar color palette, but more elements and more visual planes. This one also introduces actual greens to the palette, which helped me learn a lot in terms of leading the eye, but we'll get to that in a bit. The first thing I did notice after starting this study was that I was already much more comfortable with the color matching during this one. One reason for that is the color palette is almost identical to the last one, but also the thing I mentioned about the saturation and how turning it down makes things seem lighter as well, instead of accidentally making it more saturated like I did before. I also used this study as an opportunity to try different Devanel Kurz plant brushes to block in the bushes, but the cloud brush fit the soft vibe way better. And I'm not at all mad about it, since I like keeping my quote-unquote supplies limited. This helps me in keeping the whole art piece coherent and all. Something this screenshot also made me realize even more than the first one is to think about planes and treating each of them a little different. The best example of that is that I added a tiny bit of Gaussian blur to the furthest planes to create more visual depth and let the sharper edges in the foreground pull more of the focus. This way of dividing the visual planes onto different layers in my art program made it easier to create visual depth and kept the artwork clean. Like when I put the white airbrush at the bottom of the smaller mountain and didn't have to think about the bigger mountain in front of it, because I was basically just putting the color between the first and the second mountain. Over the last few years, I started to try and use less layers because that's something I was taught in my painting classes in university to imitate working on a real-life canvas. And it's very helpful in visually pulling the pieces together, but I've discovered that working in the same way I did with this study and only doing the rendering mostly on one singular layer makes a lot more sense for my art and my process. A little interesting note on that, which also could 100% be false by the way. From what I've gathered, this method of working is more common in the area of visual development artists, which in parts is very different from the traditional children's book illustration kind of art style they mainly focused on in the university classes I was able to take. The way they taught me in university is not wrong or anything, but it doesn't fit what I want my art style and my workflow to be like. For this study in particular, I also left out the characters because they play a pretty little role in the composition, and instead the focus on the lower left corner is mainly created through the plants. The way bigger color variation, especially around the first bush, as well as the higher level of detail in general, pulls the viewer's eye towards it. It's the classic rule of contrast creates interest at work. Though I have to admit that I got a little lost in the details and textures too fast, but oh well. As soon as I noticed that, I was able to dial it back a bit and find another solution. And for that, the watercolor brush I tried is amazing for detailed areas, and the hard edges brush is a lifesaver for details. Bringing more definition into the sand with the hard brush, for example, after using the cloud brush for the darker areas and smudging with the watercolor brush, was a genius move on my part, to be honest. Obviously, I'm not happy that I got lost in the sauce with the details again, but catching myself doing it helped me realize just quote-unquote how little work and time I have to put into the most part of the artwork. Because only the area of interest should have a decent level of detail and color variations and stuff, and even with that I shouldn't go overboard. The contrast and color variety and level of detail between the areas that are and aren't in focus of the artwork are very easy ways to lead the viewer's eye and also make the whole process faster. I've also known that the human brain likes to explain some vague shapes to itself, like how the lines in the big blue shapes are readable as trees due to context clues, but knowing it on a logical level and seeing the effect at work are two very different things. These things are pretty basic and I've known them for years, but not falling into the trap of seeing the time and energy put into a piece equal to its worth is still tricky for me sometimes. Which is why doing studies and realizing this on a practical level instead of just reading about it is so important. At the end of the study, the flowers got very messy, but this is supposed to be a quick study and I didn't learn much from copying the flowers in this one singular screenshot. So instead I got the rough composition and amount and kind of colors down and moved on to the next screenshot to study instead. This study also started with blocking in the colors, but instead of using the lasso tool like before, I used my favorite hard edge brush to block in most of the shapes. This approach simply comes easier to me most of the time and I'm happy with the results, so why change them? In this screenshot the characters were also a bigger part of the composition as well, so I roughly blocked them in but ignored any details. They're simply there for the color harmony and composition, no one cares about their facial feature or pockets at this point. Even if I did add a few details at the end, but that wasn't part of the actual study. For this third sketch, I also didn't focus on colors as much and only swatched the colors every once in a while or if I was unsure about them. And most of the time, my first estimation was actually pretty close to the real color, so I'm very happy about that. My biggest revelation here were the flowers, because those, and especially the leaves, were a big trust the process kind of moment that really worked out in the end. I made the entire greenery in the foreground with just 3 colors, 1 brush and vibes. And I'm glad I did. I just tried not to think too much about where to put the lines and not get lost in smaller details, and the entire process was so quick and the results look super nice. Maybe I could have paid a little more attention to the shapes of the flowers when I started them, but this is a study, so it's more than fine. Also, defining 1 or 2 of the bigger flowers a bit more made everything more readable without it getting overworked. Now I just need to have that confidence in actual art pieces as well. As I said before, at the very end, I did add a little detail in the form of sketchy lines to the characters to see how I'd start rendering those if I were to actually paint them. Just to see how lost I'd feel regarding the work process, but I think I'd be doing just fine. So instead of moving on to the next study, I decided to invest the energy of rendering these characters into the cover illustration instead. I was simply itching to start using what I had learned in the actual illustration right away, and you should never not use that kind of inspiration whenever it strikes.
Which means that we have reached the end of the study session. Just these 3 kinda simple studies already helped me a lot, and I feel way more confident moving on to the actual illustration I was working on. Full illustrations with rendered backgrounds and compositions that aren't just focused on the characters are a big weakness of mine and the biggest point of critique of my bachelor's project, so it's something I have to put a lot of work into to get better. Luckily, having little skill in an area also makes it easier to quickly get better at the beginning, which creates a lot of momentum. If I'm being honest, it's hard to find the time to illustrate more involved artworks with a part-time job and all other art-related things I have and want to get done, but quicker studies like these help me a lot. Same goes for documenting them with videos like this one, because it forces me to analyze everything at an even deeper level. I also purposely chose screenshots that were related to the actual illustration I'm working on, because that helps your brain to focus and retain the information. And going on to use what you just learned in action is a very good way to cement the lessons you've learned in your long-term memory. Another smart move was to build on my existing skills and picking specific elements to study. For example, I already knew a way I personally like to paint the sky and clouds, and I had some plant brushes that I already knew, but needed to play around with to figure out a way to stylize foliage. So while these studies were for sure a challenge and a big learning opportunity, I was careful not to overwhelm myself or crash my self-esteem in this area even more. Personally, I think it's one of the most important things you should have in mind when choosing exercises to practice your art skills, or skills in general for that matter. That being said, I don't want this to come off as me bashing myself or my skills either. It's just recognizing my flaws to be able to work on them and get better. Overall, I was simply having fun discovering the lessons I could take from the screenshots and the way the artists create various effects in the composition, and I'm super excited to improve on my previous color sketch for my mermaid illustration. Thank you so much for joining me in working on my art skills, and I hope you got to take something from this for your own experience as well. I already have some other movies in mind I would like to do studies of, and if you happen to have some ideas for movies as well, please let me know in the comments. I hope you will join me for future revelations by subscribing, but for now I'll get to edit this video and I'll hopefully see you in the next one. So, bye bye!